Welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today, we're sitting down to discuss My Sister the Serial Killer by Nigerian writer Oyinkan Braithwaite, recently longlisted for the 2019 Booker Prize, a list the judges say comprised of energetic, diverse voices, bold and lyrical, and some a little wild.
It's a rare head-to-head episode, as both our book clubs have read it, but what did they make of it? Would we have longlisted it? Listen in to find out. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Laura, and welcome to the Book Club Review on location, as we're at your house. And it's so nice sitting around your lovely living room and looking at all these nice books on the shelves. And I was thinking, so many of them feel like old friends to me, either because they're ones that we did for the pod, or they're ones that I know that you've read, that you've told me about, so I feel like I've read them too, or they're ones that I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'd really like to read that. It's been very nice.
Oh, I love that. I find it quite stressful having lots of books on my shelf that I haven't read. How they kind of look at me reproachfully. This is probably only half the books I have in this house. It's just that most are in the attic. But I have read most of these here. And as you say, there's lots of old friends like Barbarian Days I can see in the distance, and The Snow Leopard.
And I can see Peter Carey's A Long Way From Home up there, which always makes me smile because that's one that we were going to do for the pod. You did it for book club.
Did we never discuss it?
I read it, totally loved it.
Did you?
Was dying to talk about it. Had so much to say about it. And then I think we just got really behind and life got really busy. That was maybe when I had the baby. And I remember we were just like, you know what, we'll just skip that one, it'll be fine. To this day, it remains the book I never got to discuss.
The book that got away.
That's right. For anyone listening out there who hasn't read A Long Way From Home by Peter Carey, it's really good. I can't recommend it highly enough. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if Laura would agree, but anyway.
That's a whole different episode.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back to it in the future.
It's the episode that you're never going to hear. Sorry.
Today, we are sitting down to discuss My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. Your book club actually chose this one first. How did you guys come to choose it?
It was because we'd had this thing where we were going to be reading War and Peace in the background. And so we needed to do things that were not too demanding for our interim book club meetups. And I just got this, it was a library request that had come in, and I was quite excited to read it. And I remember saying to everyone, oh, I've just got this, by the way, and showed them the cover. And obviously the cover is really striking. It's the kind of thing where you sort of see it and you think, oh, wow, what's that going to be like? And I think they were all just quite swayed. So I think it was down to me that we ended up reading this. How about you guys?
It was also down to me. We have had a lot of longer book club books recently, and I thought, great, if we can double up and debate it from both our book club sides, perfect, let's go with that. And certainly my book club was really keen because this book has been in the press so much. There's been a lot of coverage. It was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and just now it's been longlisted for the Booker Prize too. So this is not a kind of fly under the radar book. It's well above the radar, waving itself around. And I think a lot of that has to do with the cover, as you say, but also just the title, My Sister, the Serial Killer.
We should probably try and describe the cover, shouldn't we, for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's a shot of a very attractive woman with a sort of headscarf, and she's wearing sunglasses. She looks very cool. And the type is a sort of lime green, very large capitals, My Sister the Serial Killer. And then when you look closely, it's not the first thing you notice, but there's something about it, perhaps subconsciously, you don't realise. But then when you look really closely, what you see is the reflection in her glasses is actually a hand holding a dagger.
I've never noticed that.
So subtle, but it's so good. So amazing cover. Did the novel inside live up to this?
Well, that's up for debate. I do think this book has got a lot of attention because of the name, and it's just such a great hook. And equally, the opening. I'm just going to read that opening here. So this is the very beginning of the book. Ayula summons me with these words. Corretti, I killed him. I had hoped I would never hear those words again.
It's a good first line.
And then it goes on into a different chapter. So the book's broken up into quite short chapters, really, isn't it?
It's a short book. They're short chapters. If your book club is looking for something to read, that's just a breath of fresh air because it's so short. This is a really, really good choice. It's easy to read and the writing is very immediate. You get caught up in it quite quickly and easily.
I'm kind of wondering if that's the most positive thing we're going to say about it.
It's set in Lagos, and it is this relationship between these two sisters, and there is the older sister, Corretti, who is the sort of sensible one. She's a head nurse in a hospital. She has a sensible job, a serious job with responsibilities, and she's obviously a kind of dependable person who you can rely on. And she's got this flighty sister who doesn't take life seriously is incredibly beautiful. So life unfurls itself before her in that way that for very beautiful people it can do sometimes. Things just sort of happen for them, don't they? And they're used to that and they don't question it. So the sister is always taking pictures of herself. Her Instagram feed, she's got sort of hundreds of thousands of followers. She's got a clothing line that she sort of makes things and sells them, but she doesn't have a sort of very serious life. It doesn't have a lot of purpose to it, and Karidi really struggles with this.
I think what she struggles with even more, though, is the fact that this beautiful, quite charming, seemingly innocent, harmless woman keeps killing her boyfriends.
And then there's that.
And then there's that.
And I mean, maybe it's even one of the kind of things that works really well about this novel is that there's something that feels very familiar and true, which is about this sibling relationship. And then the other elements that come into it are the relationship they have with their mother and then the father. It's an important family dynamic, but particularly this relationship between them, which feels very recognisable. And it's almost like she takes that to an extreme by introducing this idea of murder. And then what she does with that is quite delicious and enjoyable, I thought.
I'm not sure I totally agree, but let me read a piece of the book that speaks to that relationship and then the heightened stakes that comes when murder gets involved. I am the older sister. I am responsible for Ayula. That's how it has always been. Ayula would break a glass and I would receive the blame for giving her the drink. Ayula would fail a class and I would be blamed for not coaching her. Ayula would take an apple and leave the store without paying for it, and I would be blamed for letting her get hungry. I wondered what would happen if Ayula were caught. If for once she were held responsible for her actions. I imagine her trying to blag her way out of it and being found guilty. The thought tickles me. I relish it for a moment, and then I force myself to set the fantasy aside. She is my sister. I don't want her to rot in jail. And besides, Ayula being Ayula, she would probably convince the court that she was innocent. Her actions were the fault of her victims, and she had acted as any reasonable, gorgeous person would under the circumstances.
So there you go. I mean, she loves her. That's one of the things I liked about it. I thought that dynamic between them was really good. Despite everything, she's her sister and she loves her. And then when gradually you learn more about the family situation, so at the beginning you learn that the father has died and they're going to have a memorial service for his sort of the 10th anniversary of his death. And then as the novel goes on, gradually it becomes clearer and clearer how dark that relationship was.
Ooh, that's a good moment for me just to say that we are going to talk spoilers this episode, aren't we?
Yeah, I think probably most of you listening will have read it. If you haven't read it and you don't want us to spoil the ending for you, then I'm very sorry. You'll have to switch off now. Although you might want to come back about 5 minutes before the end for our recommendations. It's a short book. It's been so popular. I suspect most people listening will have read it. So we're going to let ourselves go, even though it's very uncharacteristic of me. I don't like to spoil.
No, but also it's just going to be, there's just so much to discuss. We don't want to tie ourselves down.
And also, I think if you took out the element that what you come to learn is that this was an abusive relationship, this father was a very dominant, threatening presence in their lives. If you took that out of the novel, what you would be left with would be something incredibly insubstantial and flimsy and sort of disposable. I mean, one of the criticisms that came up in book club was it just didn't feel like there was that much to it. But I did feel, if anything, this complicated family dynamic and this relationship with the father that then perhaps to some degree explained the oddness in the sisters' behaviour, because they are quite odd in their own different ways, to me kind of gave it weight and depth that it needed.
Okay, so let's get into this, because I agree with you in theory, and my book club would agree with you in theory, but we thought this book was so shabbily executed. It was rushed, it was meandering. A great discussion for my book club. We love discussing it because there are so many themes, and even now with you, I'm like, yeah, no, totally. The father figure, that does explain. But it really doesn't, because it's so superficial, the level of depth she goes into, and it's so unsatisfactory in my mind. Someone said at one point, and they're like, I was kind of a third of the way through, and I was like, am I just not getting it? Because the reviews have been so effusive, and they say it's such a brilliant satire, and it's so funny. And she's like, and actually, I just think it's rubbish. It's just a book that had a great title, and had a great pitch, and publishers got really excited about it, and then the manuscript got turned in, and you can just see the publishers going, oh no.
I listened to an interview with her, and apparently it was originally written as a novella. And the publishers went back to it and said, we think this is great. Could you expand it into a novel? Can you make more of it? And I think if you know that, you kind of can see that. I think it would have been much better as a novella, you know, shorter, tighter, packing more of a punch.
Did you find it funny?
I did, actually.
Really?
I did. But again, I just found that relationship and the sort of long suffering. Is it because I'm an elder sister?
Maybe, and I'm the younger sister.
It is possible. You know, that sort of long suffering. And also my younger sister is quite beautiful. So, but not as far as I know, in any way dangerous. Yeah. I mean, it's true. My book club were also, I have to say, fairly critical of this book. And when we looked at the scores, they were sort of giving it really low scores. I think sort of 2 out of 5 stars, 1.5.
Oof, I love it.
Amanda at one point just said, look, are we over-analysing this or are we asking more of it than it can offer? You know, we had a good discussion, but it was one of those ones where it felt like because we brought a lot to it.
That's exactly the same with my book club.
We had to work quite hard.
We talked a lot about all of the themes that come in the book. So domestic violence, a woman being violent and striking back against the patriarchy effectively, because Ayoola milks her beauty for everything she can get.
Yeah.
And you never ever see a dark side to her except in her actions, which is that she just keeps killing her boyfriends without provocation. Initially, Coretti thinks that she's doing it in self-defense. The book opens with Coretti cleaning up the murder of Femi. And this is the first murder where Ayoola hasn't cried, hasn't shown remorse. It's the third killing, which is why Coretti is starting to wonder if her sister is a serial killer, because that is the definition. There's an older lover who she seems to poison when they're on holiday in Dubai. And then we haven't mentioned the very handsome, charming doctor at Coretti's hospital, who Coretti has been, nursing a deep tundra for the past year. Ayoola comes in to take her out for lunch, and for Tade, this handsome doctor, it's love at first sight.
Yeah, he claps eyes on her and immediately he's completely smitten. And if he had ever had any thoughts towards Coretti of anything more than sort of, working relationship, quite an affectionate one, but nonetheless, immediately that is all completely blown away.
And Ayoola just accepts it as her due. But she then keeps killing these men because she seems to, at some subconscious level, despise the way that they treat her. And Coretti's trying to convince her that Tade is different, saying, he's different, you can't do this, just leave him alone. And Ayoola's like, no, what are you talking about? He's exactly the same. It's just about a pretty face. And that is true, of course. Tade doesn't know anything about her, and that's what Coretti comes to realise.
I thought it was kind of interesting, this idea of these women in a world of men and the sense of the power dynamics in Nigeria where it's set. I would have liked it more if there had been more of that and that was more nuanced. The other thing we talked about was the sense of place, where again, I liked the little tiny touches that you got of a sense of place, but there wasn't much of it.
Frances said the same, but in the same breath she said, a Nigerian writer shouldn't have to evoke Nigeria for people who have never been there. In the same way that certain authors might not make place a big part of their novel if it was set in London. They would just take it for granted. So I agree, and my book club picked up on that too. They're like, she talks about the traffic, she talks about the rain and the heat, but they're just little touches. You don't get a sense beyond that.
For me, one of the scenes that stuck with me was when she's driving to the hospital and she's stopped by a police officer or a traffic cop, and she feels really threatened, and she knows she's in a situation where nothing she can say or do will affect how he treats her. She knows that she's going to get treated badly and unfairly unless she does what she does, which is to offer him a bribe.
And even before that, she only rolls down the window by probably about 3 or 4 inches because she doesn't want him to reach in and open her door.
Yeah, and I thought...
Which is sinister.
So I thought that was really powerful and did set the scene. Also, the house that they live in, it's affluent suburb, it's all quite nice, but it's this sort of strange thing where it's this sort of big house that they live in with this absence at its heart, which is the absence of this father, the one who made the money, the one who controlled their lives.
And made the money through corruption, through passing off used cars as new cars and other types of wheeling dealing.
Yeah.
And the reason they can't leave that house is because the deeds for the land it's built on are so dubious that they don't want anyone to look into it. So there is a lot there, I think, in terms of giving you a sense of what Nigerian culture and life might be like.
Yeah.
But perhaps not as atmospheric as some reviewers have made it out to be, where they're like, oh, yes, it's an incredible portrait of Lagos.
I think you make a really good... Well, I think Frances makes a really good point. And actually, if I'd been at the book club, that would have swayed me slightly, because I think you're right. There was a sense of... It's sort of alien to me, but yeah, a different place, a different culture, different cultural rules.
The men are pretty terrible.
Yeah, you certainly don't feel sympathetic towards any of them, even Tade, the one you kind of like. But then, you see, this is where it starts to become problematic, because I think it's fair to say outside of that relationship between the two sisters, and even within it, it's only really Coridi where you really sense any character development. With everybody else, they're just cutouts.
They are. They're stock characters, and someone in book club likened it to a sitcom at moments. You know, Coredi's fellow nurses behind the counter, like selling shoes, talking crap to each other. It was just very, very light touch caricature.
Well, that reminds me of... I really like this subplot, and my book club all mocked me for it. But there's a man in a coma, Murata, and because he's unconscious and not likely to regain consciousness, Coridi feels she can go into his room and she likes to sit with him, and she doesn't have anyone else to talk to, so he's the one who hears the stories about what's been going on, and then as the reader we get to find out too. And then, of course, in a twist, one day he wakes up, and my book club were like, oh, come on. At this point it just felt like a soap opera. It was like an episode of Neighbours or Home and Away. I was like, oh, I really like that, because what I liked the sense of this lonely woman who isn't getting a loving response from her sister or her mother. Her father was a terrible relationship. She doesn't seem to have any friends. She has a sort of hierarchy at work, so she can't particularly bond with the people who work under her. She was just so lonely. For me, it was quite moving, the idea that the only person who was her friend was a man in a coma. And then when he wakes up, there's I thought, a really nice moment where, of course, she realises, oh my God, does he know? How much does he remember? And I thought that was really good.
You know, it was all right.
You didn't
it was
buy it.
fine. It was fine. And since we are giving spoilers, I mean, just the fact that he would remember this confession. Not only does he remember it, but he says, but we all have our secrets. I'm like, this is kind of a big secret. This woman is still out there killing people.
Well, again, to me, because the idea is, I think, that he then in turn appreciates the fact that his family weren't coming to visit him, you know, and while he was lying there in this unconscious state, she was the one who was there for him. And so there's a kind of nice thing where when he wakes up, he sort of appreciates her and feels warmly towards her. We discussed the ending, which I think a lot of people felt quite let down by. How about you guys?
I liked the ending, only in the sense that I didn't think that Ayoola should be found out. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't want her to be found out. That sounds weird. I guess I was I wasn't sure how she was going to end it, but I kind of liked the fact that she was just like, nope, it's just going to keep on going.
And I think there's this idea, isn't there, in our sort of celebrity-obsessed Instagram-led culture that we have now, that you kind of can't help liking her in that way that we like some glamorous person's feed on Instagram. It's all surface and shiny, but, you know, it's nice to look at. So there's a part of you that sort of wants her to get away with it.
But it's also because, as we said before, the men are so terrible.
Yeah, you can't really care about anyone.
And although she is wielding her beauty as a weapon, and she is vacuous, you have no sense of why she's doing this. In the actual portrait of her character, you can extrapolate, and certainly we did in the book club discussion, that it's not a parable, but there is a sense that this is just the inevitable reaction of a woman to being
objectified
by men in a very dark way. Coming back to her father, it's quite ambiguous how he died, and my book club, we went back to the passage because it would make a lot of sense if Ayoola killed him, but that is entirely unclear. And it doesn't even seem like Coredi necessarily killed him.
I thought Coredi killed him.
Really? But she's standing there in front of him and he crumples. So they're young, I should say. And he is about to basically sell the 14-year-old Ayoola to a chief because it will be very good for his business deals. And then he does die. So obviously there is some logic to the fact that they must have killed him. But the way she writes about it is confusing because Ayula's cowering behind a sofa and he just crumples in front of Coredi. So I guess the implication could be that they poison him, but she leaves it ambiguous. I found that quite annoying, to be honest. I was like, why not just make it clear?
Yeah, Amanda was commenting that it wasn't quite clear that they killed the father together. She thought that was the detail that makes the story make sense and it was important. And so it was frustrating that it needed to be a bit more clear than it was, perhaps. If that's important and makes the story make sense, then we shouldn't be wondering about it.
And I think that's true, though, of lots of moments, coming back to that slapdash, rushed feel to the writing and stitching together of the story, is that there's a lot of moments where you're just not given enough. So in book club discussion, you can chat about it to your heart's content, but it's not actually in the text. The clues aren't there necessarily. You have to extrapolate.
What are we missing then? Why has it been longlisted for the Booker Prize?
Well, because we are talking about, between our book clubs and you and me, we're talking about like 16 to 20 avid readers who were baffled by the critical acclaim. I'm usually one of the more opinionated people in my book club, you might know. I had Caitlin holding the book up, shaking it in one hand, being like, how did this get shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction? How? And then Frances, a very well-read woman, but, you know, quite mild and measured, usually in her rhetoric, wasn't there, but went out of her way to send me a long email with thoughts capitalized. And she said exactly the same thing and compared it to Ghost Wall, which I still haven't read, but which you read, which is supposed to be incredible. And she's like, Ghost Wall wasn't nominated? My Sister the Serial Killer was? Like, what is this world?
Yeah, it does seem strange. I mean, is it just this sort of fashion that seems to be going on in publishing at the moment for books coming out of Nigeria? There was the Children of Blood and Bone fantasy series, which got so much publicity and acclaim.
It's true, and neither you or I like that.
It just wasn't very good.
It just wasn't very good.
I wanted to like it.
Yeah, and I think you're right.
I think this is a million times better than that. I thought that was really awful.
True. And I do agree. It shouldn't be a fashion to have more diverse voices and to have a lot of attention given to writers from all over the world. But obviously, there are better writers out there. You know, there are some incredible Nigerian writers, and I just don't think Oyinkan Braithwaite's one of them.
Well, she might turn out to be. You know, that's the thing. She's quite young. She's just sort of starting on her writing career. I think Amanda was the most generous of all of us. When we came to our scores, I think people gave it quite low scores, but gave it 3 stars out of 5. And she said, there is something iconic about it. She said, I agree it's insubstantial, but I think it will go down as the book of 2019. I think it captures the moment. It sings. And in fact, it's not a big worthy tome with lots of plot and character development, but that's not relevant to any of the things that are good about it. I see all its weaknesses, but they're the weaknesses of a first novel. And so I think for her, she saw potential and promise. And I think that too. I like this a lot.
It's interesting. I completely disagree. I think she might be a one-hit wonder. I think this book has only really got attention because it's such a good idea. And actually, she's quite a poor writer. It's pretty thin on the ground. It's just that the title and the themes are so of the moment.
I thought it was vivid, compelling. I liked the characters. It did make me smile. I loved the kind of darkness to it. But to me, it was a beach read. In that way that it's not necessarily a definitive thing. Beach read can mean many things. But in this sense, I mean something disposable, something that is going to divert you for a few hours and then you'll put it aside and probably never think of it again.
And you know what? If it hadn't been so highly praised and hadn't been shortlisted for the Women's Prize, I think my book club would have been way nicer about it. It's just that you kind of like that elevates it to a certain level and then you start comparing it to other types of fiction. Alice Harmon in my book club is very well read and often quite opinionated, but she's like, I hate to say this, guys, and I see what you're saying, but I read it in like 3 hours on a trip down to the south of France and I really enjoyed it, and then I put it aside and then I haven't really thought about it till I came back here. Everything you're saying is true, but you know what? I'd recommend it to people.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones where definitely as a kind of a good quick page-turning read that is set in an interesting place and it works. It doesn't fall apart. It's not rubbish. It hangs together, I think, quite nicely. And I didn't question the writing. It's written very simply.
Badly written. There's some clangers in there.
I thought the dialogue was good. I thought that to me it was fine. I wasn't, and I'm pretty,
Liz, a new book club member, was very bemused by Coretti's enthusiasm for Femi's poetry. Femi is the first boyfriend that Ayoola has killed, and he has written poetry, and Karede's looking at it online after the fact, and she's like, oh, it's amazing. And Liz is like, it was the worst poetry I've ever encountered in my life. Now, maybe that's the humor that we're missing out on. You know, maybe the author is intentionally writing terrible poetry, but that wasn't obvious to us, at least. The big question, was it a good book club book?
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask. It felt for us like we were reaching, and I don't think it was such a good book club book. I would recommend it as a read, but actually I think for book club, it's almost that sense of you don't want to waste a book club. You know, you kind of want to really get something out of the things that you're reading and discussing, and this wasn't that.
I disagree. I think it was a great book club book in the sense that we had a cracking conversation about it. Some books are too good.
Only because you all laid into it so much.
But we did have a lot of in-depth discussions around gender and violence and beauty and what that can mean for an individual and for the society that interacts with them. So we really enjoyed the discussion around it, even as we felt as the novel itself was really flawed. So take from that what you will, listeners.
By now, I imagine you have very much a sense of if you tend to fall in my camp on things or if you tend to fall in Laura's camp on things. And so you can judge for yourself from these two opinions whether you think it would be good for your book club. Inspired by My Sister the Serial Killer, here are some recommendations for your next book club book.
I'm going to recommend Ponti by Sharlene Teo, which is a fairly recent novel with more than a few similarities to My Sister the Serial Killer. Now, the first thing to say is that it has nothing to do with murder, so that's one dissimilarity. It is also not set in Nigeria, so that's another dissimilarity. But otherwise, it's quite interesting how the two complement each other in some ways. Sharlene Teo, first of all, is another first-time novelist. She's Singaporean, but like Oyinkan Braithwaite, educated in the UK. She finished a master's in creative writing at the University of East Anglia, I believe, recently. And Ponti is her first novel, and it centers on fraught relationships between women. In this case, our narrator is Suze, and she's 16 years old, and her mother is an incredibly beautiful woman who's also very reclusive. She was an actress kind of 15, 20 years before in a very cult hit horror film, but ever since has kind of hidden away in their decaying home in Singapore. Suze has this quite sad relationship with her mother, and then also this brand new, highly charged friendship with another young girl at her school named Circe. Here too, we have quite a vivid depiction of the city in which the action takes place, actually much more vivid than the portrait of Lagos that Braithwaite gives us. Here, everything is just dripping with heat, and the humidity is oppressive, and the smells and the stench of the jungle and the pollution, they're kind of always with you, partially because the narrator is 16 and everything is just a bit much for her. Her physicality is a bit much for her. She kind of hates the way she looks. Again, not dissimilar to Karedi, who's always kind of obsessing over her own looks and comparing herself to Ayoola. Here, Suze is kind of disgusted by herself and just mesmerized by her mother's beauty and the impact that she continues to have on all the men she interacts with. Nothing much happens in Ponti, I have to say. You know, there's no high-stakes drama. It is a coming-of-age novel, that's how they bill it on the back. But it's really just about a young woman trying to find herself, and it's told from the different perspectives of Suze in that time and place, and then Circe, some years later, looking back and having guilt around their relationship at that time. I think it'd be a really good book club book. It's not a perfect first-time novel, and in many ways I didn't like it, but I'm desperate to talk about it with someone.
That sounds good. I'm very intrigued.
So Ponti by Sharlene Teo. The other no-brainer recommendation is Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda and Ngoze Adiche, which my book club read 6-7 years ago and still talk about as one of their favourite book club books ever. This is the story of 1960s Nigeria at a time when civil war is about to break out. And I think it was the second novel of Ngoze Adiche, who is an incredible writer. And she was the breakthrough star, I'd say, of Nigerian writers when she published Purple Hibiscus 10, 15 years ago, probably longer now. She's also written Why We Should All Be Feminists, which would be a very good complement to My Sister the Serial Killer, really, because it's about feminism generally, but also with a lot that is drawn from Ngoze Adiche's experiences in Nigeria and the gender culture there. Those would both be really good book club books.
I asked my book club at the end of the session what they would recommend, and that was the one that came up, and also Americanah, because they were saying...
Also very good.
It's contemporary Nigeria, the ambitions of relatively well-off, educated Nigerians, and then the way that people tend to leave for their education abroad, but then they end up longing for home. And they said it was about finding where you belong, and they thought that would be good. I was going to recommend Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, which is a Japanese book, Japanese novelist. This was also a kind of a buzz book. Did the rounds on Instagram. I think you read it and loved it, didn't you?
I did, very much.
Also very short and sweet read. It's about a woman who doesn't really have any feelings or emotions. She's sort of very detached in a way that's sort of psychopathic. There's something slightly sinister about it, but at the same time that's never really realised. She's not violent. She doesn't hurt anybody. In a way, she observes herself with as much puzzlement as she does the people in society around her. And it's only sometimes there are just in things that she thinks, in her responses to things, you sort of have a very keen sense of, well, that's not normal. There's something very, very, very odd about her. And she gets a job in a little supermarket, and through that repetitive work that's very codified, those same things have to be done, things have to be put in the same places, customers have to be greeted in the same way, you wear a uniform, she really finds her place, and that enables her to become a sort of reasonably functioning part of society. The trouble then is that this is not a very high status job in Japan. It's certainly not something that people would do for life. And her family start to grumble, you know, why is she not moving on? Why is she not looking for a husband? What is she doing? And she can't really bear them. In a way, you just want to say, look, just stand up for your own choice, you know, just ignore them. But obviously it bothers her that they keep on at her about it. And so she feels like she needs to do something to resolve it. And so she ends up getting one of her awful co-workers to live in her house, and there's a funny dynamic there.
It would be a great book club book.
Julie Meyerson wrote a really lovely review in The Guardian. She wrote, it's the novel's cumulative, idiosyncratic poetry that lingers, attaining a weird, fluorescent kind of beauty all of its own. And I thought, yes, that really nails it. There is something about it.
It's very special. Her writing is very special. And I think the attention that it has received is entirely due to its merits, rather than any sort of sensational marketing hook.
But I think it also would be a very good discussion book, because it's touching on the way that society expects people to behave, the way that Japanese society expects her, a young unmarried woman, to behave, and also this idea of commercialism, you know, shops, commodities, fluorescent lights. This is the world we live in now, and there's almost a sense she becomes part of the machine at the end, and it's really interesting, and whether you agree with that and think, yes, that's the way forward or not, I don't know. I just thought that there are wider implications in it that would be really interesting to discuss. So yeah, I think that would also be a good one for book club. That's all for this episode. Books recommended were Ponti by Sharlene Teo, Half of a Yellow Sun, Why We Should All Be Feminists, and Americanah by Chimamanda Ngoze Adiche, and Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing Palace Walk, the first novel in Nobel Prize winner Naguib Mahfouz's Cairo Trilogy. Mahfouz has been compared to Dickens, Tolstoy and Proust, but what did Laura's book club make of this family drama set in 1920s Cairo? Listen in to find out.
But first, keep an eye out for our interview with A.N. Devers, the owner of Second Shelf, a bookshop in London's Soho that stocks only rare books by women. That's up now.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.